A Scandinavian living room is built around one question, asked about literally everything in the room. Does this actually get used, or is it just sitting there? Everything that fails that test tends to disappear, quietly, over time, until what's left is a room that looks almost sparse by comparison to what most living rooms actually accumulate. This is probably the most universally cluttered room in most homes, because it's the room everyone in the household passes through, drops things in, and half finishes projects inside of. So today, 15 specific things that get removed from a Scandinavian living room, and the actual reasoning behind each one. Real quick, if these videos bring you something, following the channel genuinely helps and takes about 2 seconds. Let's start with the piece of furniture that usually decides the entire personality of the room before anyone even walks in. A television treated as the dominant visual focus. In most living rooms, the TV gets the best wall, the largest piece of furniture underneath it, and every other piece of seating angled to face it directly. A Scandinavian living room tends to treat the television as one function among several, not the organizing principle of the entire space. It gets a spot, often smaller than expected, sometimes tucked into a cabinet that closes when it's not in use, rather than commanding the room the second you walk in. Right beside it, almost always, sits the second offender. A coffee table buried under remote controls and unopened mail. This is one of the fastest surfaces in any home to become a permanent catch-all, because it sits directly in the path of anyone sitting down after a long day, and setting something down there takes zero effort compared to putting it away properly. A Scandinavian coffee table tends to hold very little at any given time, one object with a clear purpose, a candle, a single book currently being read, and nothing that's simply been abandoned there out of convenience. Behind the television, almost without exception, there's a third culprit most people have simply stopped noticing. A visible tangle of cables running to every device in the room. Cable management sounds like a minor detail until you actually look at how much visual noise a nest of cords creates in a room otherwise designed to feel calm. Scandinavian setups tend to route cables behind furniture, through simple cable channels, or bundled and tucked out of sight entirely, so the eye isn't constantly tripping over a mess of black wires every time it lands on the entertainment area. Then there's a softer kind of clutter, easy to miss because it looks decorative rather than messy. A pile of throw pillows that gets removed every evening and has nowhere specific to go. 6 or 8 pillows scattered across a sofa look intentional in a furniture catalog. In practice, most of them get shoved aside the moment someone actually wants to sit down, and then pile up somewhere on the floor or an armchair until the next time guests come over. A Scandinavian sofa tends to hold 2 or 3 pillows, chosen deliberately, with an actual home to return to once they've been moved. Furniture itself is worth a mention here too, specifically furniture that's been collected piece by piece over years, with no unifying plan behind any of it. A chair inherited from one relative, a side table bought on sale that didn't quite match anything, a bookshelf that seemed fine in the store and doesn't actually fit the room. Individually, none of these choices seem like a problem. Together, they produce a room that feels visually chaotic even when it's technically tidy, because nothing in it was chosen in relation to anything else. A Scandinavian living room tends to be furnished more slowly, with each new piece evaluated against what's already there, rather than acquired independently and left to compete for attention. This connects to a broader habit worth naming: the difference between furnishing a room all at once versus letting it accumulate reactively over years. A room furnished all at once, even on a modest budget, tends to have a coherent logic running through it, because every piece was chosen with the others already in mind. A room that fills in gradually, one purchase at a time whenever something felt urgently needed, often ends up with pieces that were each reasonable on their own, but were never actually evaluated against each other. Slowing down the furnishing process, sometimes leaving a genuine gap unfilled for months while the right piece gets found rather than the first available one, is a small habit that prevents a huge amount of this kind of accumulated mismatch before it ever has the chance to happen. Related to that, and just as common, is furniture that's simply too large for the room it's sitting in, an oversized sectional that blocks half the walking path, a coffee table so big it leaves barely a foot of clearance on any side. Scale matters enormously to how a room feels, and a piece of furniture that overwhelms its own space makes even a genuinely clean room read as cramped and cluttered, regardless of how little is actually sitting on any given surface. This particular mistake often comes from furniture shopping in a showroom rather than in the actual room it will eventually occupy. A sofa that looks proportionate inside a spacious furniture store, surrounded by other large pieces and high ceilings, can look and feel completely different once it's squeezed into a smaller living room at home. Scandinavian furniture shopping culture tends to emphasize measuring the actual space carefully beforehand, and erring toward a slightly smaller piece rather than the largest one that will technically fit, precisely because a room with breathing room around its furniture reads as calmer than a room where every piece is pressed right up against the next. Now, I should say this clearly, because watching a video like this and feeling motivated for one evening isn't the same as actually fixing a room that's been accumulating clutter for years. That's exactly why I built the Scandinavian Reset, and the Calm Home Reset module inside it walks through this exact room, with an actual room-by-room checklist for the living room specifically, not just general advice. It's a real guide, worksheets and all, not another video to watch. Links in the pinned comment, or you can find it directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. Back to the room, and a category of clutter that tries very hard to look intentional. Coffee table books stacked purely for show, never actually opened. There's nothing wrong with a beautiful book on display. The problem is when the stack exists entirely as set dressing, chosen for the color of its spine rather than any interest in what's inside it. A Scandinavian home tends to keep books that are actually being read, or that were genuinely meaningful at some point, rather than books purchased specifically to be looked at and never opened. Flooring is worth mentioning too, because it's easy to overlook as a source of clutter, but wall-to-wall carpet does something specific that a Scandinavian living room tends to avoid. It traps dust, muffles the natural light bouncing around a room, and makes the space feel permanently furnished in a single, unchangeable way. Natural wood floors with a single, simple rug placed deliberately achieve the same comfort underfoot, while keeping the room feeling lighter and easier to actually keep clean. There's a bigger structural issue underneath a lot of this too, worth naming directly. A living room trying to do 5 jobs at once: television room, home office, playroom, dining space, guest room, all crammed into a single space, with no clear primary function. When a room is asked to do everything, it ends up looking like it does nothing particularly well. Every function needs its own equipment, its own storage, its own visual footprint, and all of that competes for the same square footage and the same visual attention. A Scandinavian living room tends to have one clear primary purpose, usually rest and conversation, with other functions either given their own dedicated space elsewhere or folded in only when actually needed, rather than permanently occupying the room. This shows up especially clearly with home office equipment that migrated into the living room during periods of remote work and simply never migrated back out. A laptop stand, a second monitor, a stack of paperwork, all sitting semi-permanently on what used to be a side table, quietly turning a space meant for rest into a space that also, visually, still looks like work is happening there even during the evening. A Scandinavian approach tends to treat work equipment as something that gets closed up and put away at the end of the day, even if it lives in the living room out of necessity, specifically so the room can fully switch back into its intended purpose once the workday actually ends. A smaller, related problem shows up on the side table next to the main seating. It becomes a catch-all for whatever the day produced: a phone charger, a stray sock, a half-finished cup of tea from 2 days ago. The same one object, one home principle that applies to the coffee table applies here too. A side table holds a lamp and maybe one other deliberately placed item, not the daily overflow of everything that didn't have anywhere else to go. Electronics deserve their own mention beyond just the television itself. Extra gaming consoles, old streaming devices no longer in use, and a tangle of controllers sitting in a basket that never gets sorted. If a piece of electronics hasn't been used in the last few months, it's not equipment anymore. It's clutter that happens to have a power cord. Furniture placement itself can become its own kind of clutter too, specifically when it blocks the room's natural walking path. A chair positioned so that getting to the window means walking around it. A table that forces an awkward detour to reach the door. A Scandinavian living room is arranged with movement in mind first, decoration second, because a room that's uncomfortable to actually move through undermines the calm it's supposed to provide, no matter how nice any individual piece looks on its own. Shelving and mantels are worth a specific mention too, because they tend to accumulate small decorative objects faster than almost any other surface in the room. A candle here, a small frame there, a souvenir from years ago, until the entire shelf is a wall of individually minor objects that collectively read as visual noise. A Scandinavian mantel tends to hold a small handful of objects, each one meaningful enough to justify the space, with real empty area left visible between them. And finally, a piece of furniture almost every home has at least one of. The formal sofa or chair that exists purely to look presentable, and that nobody in the household actually sits in. It usually ends up near the entrance or against the wall furthest from the television, upholstered in a fabric too nice to actually relax on, functioning more as a museum piece than a seat. A Scandinavian living room doesn't really have a version of this. Every seat is meant to be sat in, regularly, which means the room ends up smaller in furniture count but larger in actual usable space. 15 things. And underneath all of them, the same test this video opened with. Does this get used, or is it just sitting there? A living room built around that one question ends up simpler than most people expect. Not because it's been stripped down for a photograph, but because everything left in it earned its place through actual daily use. There's a broader pattern worth noticing across all 15 of these, now that we've gone through the whole list. Almost nothing on it is about owning fewer things in some abstract, moralistic sense. It's about a much narrower, more practical question, repeated 15 times in 15 slightly different forms. Is this object still doing its job? Or has it quietly become part of the room's background noise, taking up space and visual attention without actually contributing anything to how the room functions or feels? Furniture, cables, pillows, books, decorative objects, none of them are inherently good or bad. They just either pass that test or they don't, and a Scandinavian living room is simply the result of applying that test consistently, room by room, object by object, over years rather than during one motivated weekend. That consistency is really the part worth taking from this more than any individual item on the list. A single decluttering session gets a room back to zero. It doesn't keep the room there. The actual difference between a living room that stays calm and one that slowly refills with clutter again within a few months isn't the initial clear out. It's whether that same simple test, does this get used or is it just sitting there, gets applied automatically to everything new that tries to enter the room afterward. If this changed how you look at your own living room, following the channel means a lot. And drop your next video idea in the comments. I read every single one, and a lot of what ends up here starts right there. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.